Okay, I'm going to start reading at verse 1 in Matthew chapter 2. It says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, 'Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.' When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and the teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. 'In Bethlehem in Judea,' they replied, 'for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be shepherd of my people.' Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him.' After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route." Let's start today with the Magi. They're the very first characters that we get introduced to in verse 1 that might be a little bit strange to us. Who were these Magi? In their own setting, by the way, this is probably the best description I can give. They were astrologers, scholars from like the area of Persia or Babylon. The scriptures say they were from the east. They came from the east. And Magi would have been, in their own setting, they would have been considered scholars. They were astrologers. They studied the stars. They looked for signs. They would have probably been revered in their own setting. That's important to know. But from a Jewish perspective, as they come to Jerusalem, I want you to realize these were the very last people you would ever expect to invite to the birthday party of your Messiah. Here's what I mean by that. The Jewish people would have considered these people pagan because they were astrologers. They would have considered them idolaters. They would have been looked at, just despised. This was a group of people who loved the one God who created heaven and earth, who believed that God had revealed himself in the scriptures, and this idea that there were people out there who were following occult practices from the Jewish point of view, these were the most despised people. And I want to just kind of follow the trajectory here and point this out as accurately as I can so you can get the picture. Sometimes we have this picture, it's kind of the romantic picture you have in your mind, that there was a star and it was over their heads and they were following it along as they came to Jerusalem. That's probably not what happened, and actually, if you carefully read what was written here, you get another picture. This is probably what happened. They were people who watched the stars, and as they were watching the stars, they kind of counted up where every star was, and suddenly they saw, probably as they looked to the west, they saw a star up in the sky. It appeared. One night it was not there, the next night it's there. And when they saw that star, they were people who believed that was a sign from the heavens. And either by the light of their own knowledge or through some written prophecy in their culture, they came to think to themselves that the appearing of that star corresponded to a king being born, and particularly in Israel. Which is why they travel from wherever they come from in the east in Persia all the way to the capital city, to Jerusalem. So at least at this point, you shouldn't think of the star kind of going over their head. That was not how it was happening. Actually, they saw the star appear. It was there in the sky. They said, aha, this means there's a king born in Israel. And they go to the capital city, to Jerusalem, to make an inquiry, which is what we kind of pick things up in verse 3. It says, King Herod heard this, and he was disturbed. We'll talk about why King Herod was disturbed. And now this phrase, and all Jerusalem with him. Why all Jerusalem with him? Because these were the very last people you would ever invite to the birthday party of your Messiah. This was just outrageous. This is unbelievable. Herod calls together the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and he says, listen, If there's a Messiah born, where's that going to be? And I want you to see what happened here. This is really important to understand the sequence. It was by the light of nature, by the light of their own reasoning, by the light of their culture, that they got to Jerusalem. But they didn't get all the way to Jesus. They needed something else to get them all the way to Jesus. That something else turns out to be the Scriptures. Because here's what's happened now, that they get to Jerusalem, but they haven't found Jesus yet. The chief priests, the teachers of the law, they look in the Scriptures. All right, if there's a king born, where's it going to be? If there's a Messiah to be born, where's it going to be? And from the book of Micah, turns out that the answer is Bethlehem. And you see here in verse 6, there's a scripture passage, Micah, that's quoted, and the answer is in Bethlehem. And so now, Bethlehem is about a 6-7 mile journey from Jerusalem. This is where, if you had a picture in your mind of following a star, this is where your picture now becomes accurate, because it does say here that after they listened to the king, they went on their way. In verse 9 it says, "And the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was." Now, just for accuracy's sake, often when you picture the nativity scene, the star is over the stable, right? It's over the child. But I want you to see what it says here. The star was first over the Magi. It was going ahead of them. So you can picture from the journey to Jerusalem, the star is over their head, and finally then, it's over Jesus' head. It stops where Jesus is. And I think Matthew does this on purpose. It's reminiscent of the Old Testament. I don't know if you remember this, but when the Israelites were in the desert, they always knew where to make their camp and when to break camp and go on to the next place. Do you remember how? Because there was a cloud, which they followed by the day, and a pillar of fire, which they followed at night, and that led them over their heads wherever they went, and they followed that. And here I think is what Matthew is saying. These magi have now been included in and are considered God's people. They are the true Israel now, who goes to the birthplace of Messiah, and I think that's why it says that they were overjoyed at the star's appearance. I mean, God, in a sense, was claiming these now as his people, and when they get there, look what they do. They open up their treasures, they offer gifts, they live to give, if I can put it that way. They give themselves away in worship of this child. Now, Herod had said to them, if you look back at verse 8, he says, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I may go and worship too." And you got to read it like this: may go and worship. Because Herod doesn't have in mind to go and worship Jesus. Instead, he has in mind to try to kill Jesus, which we're not going to continue reading in chapter 2, but if you were to continue reading on, you'll see that was Herod's plan, to put this rival king to death. Before I move on, I'm going to talk about the two more important characters, King Herod and then Jesus. Before I move on, I want to once again state this as accurately as I can, and then an application point. So this is what happened. The Magi, by the light of nature, by the light of their own reason, by their own culture, they were drawn to know that there was a king, a savior. And they went to Jerusalem, but it didn't get them all the way there. It only got them most of the way there. And then they needed something, the Bible, this book, which then brought them all the way to Jesus. Okay, that's a progression that we find here, and application point. I believe that every single one of us, by the light of nature, by our own reason and conscience, even in our own culture, somewhere deep down knows there's God. We know that there is a God. We know that he exists. Sometimes we suppress that knowledge. Sometimes we don't want to admit it, but we hear his voice. We know somehow he exists. And there may be some of you who are here today, you have the sense like, okay, there is a God. The light of nature, your own reasoning, your own conscience, it gets you sort of there, but not all the way. And what's going to get you the whole way to the Savior, to the King, is this book. And I'd like to just say this. Here we are on the cusp of a new year. This Bible is so important. It literally, it's alive, it's active, and it'll bring do you want to get close to God? This is the way. I mean, there's so many people here who would give you their testimony. My own testimony, this is the way. If you want to be close to God, here's how you get there. And I'd just like to encourage you as you think about this new year, especially if you've never done so before, just make a daily habit of opening up this book and reading. I promise you it'll absolutely change your life. Okay, let's move on. The two most important characters in these 12 verses are Herod and Jesus. And actually, the key word in this passage, you can spend some time counting it up, it's actually a word that's repeated more than any other word in this passage. It's the word king. So you see in verse 1, it says, during the time of King Herod. Then in verse 2, there's this question. The Magi ask, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? They're referring to Jesus. It's interesting. In this passage, there are two kings. King Herod and King Jesus. And we'll talk about this more in just a minute, but whenever you have two kings, there is one and only one natural question. To whom do you owe your allegiance? Are you with this king or that king? Are you aligned with this one or that one? And that's certainly the question of this passage. There are two kings. And by the way, the Bible says that Jesus came when the time was right, when the time had been fulfilled. God had prepared and had put everything in place exactly the way he wanted, and that's when the Son of God came into this world. And it just so happened when he came into this world, there was a king on the throne. His name was King Herod. I'm going to talk a little bit about him. He was one of the most astonishing, fascinating characters, probably in all of world history. We'll talk about him in just a minute. It could not have been, I mean, these two, King Herod and King Jesus, so totally different from each other, it's going to be unbelievable. And so let's work our way through, and we're going to find just two totally different paradigms, two totally different kings, and at the end we're just going to ask this question. To whom do you owe your allegiance? Who are you with? Who are you behind, so to speak? So let's start with Herod, and here's how I'll get at it. Let's start with geography. So if you look at the map behind me, this is the world map, you see the E in live. The bottom part of that is over the Mediterranean Sea, and just to the right then is where the nation of Israel is. That's the map I'm putting here on the screen. Now in Jesus' day, the borders of Israel as a country would have looked something like this. The very top of the screen, kind of in the center, you see a lake or a sea. That's the Sea of Galilee. There's actually a river that runs all the way down. That's the Jordan River. That's on the very right side of the border. And hopefully you can see this kind of nearing the bottom in the center of the screen. There's the Dead Sea. And so that kind of makes out the outline of where Israel was. Just to the south of that, there was another country, is the country of Edom. The Edomites were the descendants, by the way, of Esau. As you read through biblical history, you'll find out that the Israelites and the Edomites were historic enemies of one another. At any rate, Herod actually was an Edomite. His mother grew up in what was one of the most important cities in Edom, a city that many of us know today. It's Petra. I'll show you a picture. This city was just a city of tremendous wealth. It was cut out of the rock. It is often called the Pearl of Arabia, this unbelievable place of wealth and luxury. And Herod's mother was from there. Herod's father was a very wealthy man. He was a merchant. He was in the spice trade and had a lot of authority and power. In fact, Rome, in his lifetime, when Herod was a very young boy, came in and defeated the Edomites. And Herod's father was a kind of politically savvy guy, cozied up to the Romans. And because he cozied up to the Romans, he won a lot of favors and became even more wealthy. So Herod, as a young child, got the very best education. He was trained in logic and Latin and got a really classical education. He had tremendous potential and promise. In fact, by the time he was just in his early 20s, because he had such tremendous potential, Rome took note of that, and the Senate of Rome named him the governor of Galilee. I mentioned to you that at the top of the screen there's the Sea of Galilee, that kind of lake area. And up near the top then, that region at the top, Herod was named the governor of Galilee. This was his early 20s, so I mean, this is a kid of great promise. He was going places. And here's the thing. After he was named the governor of Galilee, something happened in Jerusalem. There was a family. They were called the Hasmoneans. And Rome had been occupying Jerusalem. The Hasmoneans rose up. They had a revolt, and they kicked the Romans out of Jerusalem, and they retook the city. And the Hasmoneans were gaining in power. And Herod became very concerned about this because he was afraid that the entire country of Israel might, in one way or another, be able to revolt, that he himself would get kicked out. And so this is what Herod did. He actually traveled to Rome. The year was about 40 BC. He traveled to Rome, and he went to the Roman city. Senate, his friend was a fellow by the name of Mark Antony. Anyone just like kind of starting to remember this from like world history class? This whole Cleopatra stuff is all in there, right? Mark Antony, his good friend, took him to the Roman Senate, and they convinced the Senate to name him King of the Jews. They made him ruler over Jerusalem and the entire land of Israel and Edom, and he was given that authority. He was actually given an army to go back with. I'm showing you here a picture in Rome of the hill called Capitoline, and history tells us that Herod, along with Mark Antony and another fellow, Octavius, who would later become Caesar Augustus, actually ascended into this temple together and made animal sacrifices to the Roman gods and cemented their friendship together. Herod went back. He took an army with him. They laid siege to Jerusalem. The siege lasted for 3 years, but in the year 37 BC, Jerusalem fell, and Herod was now totally in control. So you now think about this. They starved the people out for 3 years, and then finally they ransacked the city, and now Herod's in total control. Let me ask you a question. You're Herod. You're now in control of this new city with a populace that hates you. How do you keep the peace? Answer: with an iron fist. And actually, that's what Herod is known for in history. He was just an absolutely brutal guy. He executed his enemies. He laid down his iron fist. He taxed people heavily. Talking about taxes, Herod was an unbelievably wealthy guy. I'm going to show you a picture here. This is a picture of his swimming pool. He had a palace in the city of Jericho. I don't know if you remember the story in the Bible of Zacchaeus. He was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. He climbed up into a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted. Do you remember the story? Right? It's from the Gospel of Luke. And Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, and he was in the city of Jericho. Why Jericho? Jericho was like the city of the rich and famous. A lot of people had kind of like winter homes there, and Herod did as well. He built this great big palace, and this pool was unique. By the way, as we talk about Herod's life, I'm going to tell you about several of his swimming pools. He had a lot of great swimming pools. This was a unique one because it was actually a double pool, which you can see, filled with fresh water, and this pool is very, very famous. Herod was known as a ruthless guy. Anyone who was a potential rival, he killed. Let me tell you, he was married when he came to power in Jerusalem. The name of his first wife was Doris. They had a 3-year-old child together. And when he became king of the Jews and got to Jerusalem, guess what happened? He decided his marriage was no longer politically expedient, and he banished Doris from the land along with their 3-year-old child. He also married, history tells us it was because of love, but also for political reasons. You remember the Hasmoneans, the family that had captured Jerusalem? They had a daughter. Her name was Mariamne. She was well regarded and known to be the most beautiful young woman in the entire land. And he wanted her, he married her, and partly for love, but also for political gain. It turns out that Mariamne, she had a younger brother. His name was Aristobulus. She came to him one day, and history tells us this. She said, "Listen, please, my younger brother, give him a position of authority in Jerusalem. Let him have, some position, so he'll have some social standing." And do you know that Herod was so worried that his brother-in-law might be a rival that he actually drowned him in this pool, which was the first family member he killed. He would later go on to kill his wife, Mariamne. He killed her. A couple of their children he killed. Why? Because anyone who was a rival stood in his way and needed to be removed. In fact, he was known as a crazed megalomaniac. He killed everyone who might be a potential rival. Let's talk a little bit, this is one of his swimming pools, about his wealth. Herod, this is interesting. Herod may very well have been the richest man who ever lived. Historians are sort of split, was he or was he not? But he may very well have been the richest man who ever lived. Historians, as they recount how much money he earned, he had three sources. One, he controlled all the spice trade. Now, this might not seem that interesting to you, but we have baths and showers today. They did not. Perfume was very important. He had a total monopoly on the spice trade, and he was like the Calvin Klein of his day, if I can put it that way. That was one source of income. He owned a lot of land, which he rented out, so he had income that way, and then also taxes. A lot of the taxes went into the national treasury, but some went straight into his pocketbook. Historians are divided exactly on how much he made, but what they say is this, that his annual income, every year, in the bad years was about $1 billion of today's money, and in the good years was about $10 billion today's money. So let's put that in perspective. I don't know if you remember this, February of this last year, Powerball got up, I think, finally to $564 million. I don't know if you will remember that, but can you imagine what it's like to win $564 million? Like, how would you spend it? How could you spend it? That is so much money. What would you... Herod, annual income in his worst years was twice that, $1 billion. And in his best years was like 20 times that, $10 billion. May have very well been the richest man who ever lived, which would make our Zuckerbergs and Bill Gates look like they had basically nothing. Herod wanted to make a name for himself. And so what he did all over the country, actually, if you were to visit, you can still see all the relics on the monument. He wanted to build monuments to his own name. His goal was that history would remember him. He would be in every history book. Everyone would know his name. And so he actually sought to build these fantastic, projects. I'll show you some of them. This is the temple in Jerusalem. Herod decided, he said, listen, every country has its own temple. I want my temple to be the largest in the entire world. And so the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, actually he underwent a project to rebuild it. He made it the largest man-made temple in the world. This is just a model of what it looked like. Probably you recognize this picture. This is a Western Wailing Wall. It's part of Herod's temple that still exists to this very day. I think actually this photograph is one that I took with my own camera when I was there. Look at the size of those stones. This is interesting. These stones, they didn't use any kind of mortar or cement. They were perfectly cut, so they fit into place every place. And how'd they move those stones? Do you know to this day, no one knows. Engineers estimate that the largest stone in this wall weighs something like 80,000 tons. Today, we don't have equipment that can move those stones. How'd they do it? No one knows. The closest thing we have these big cranes that can lift up cruise ships. Herod had nothing. How did he move these stones, 80,000 tons, from the quarry to where it stands today? That's the temple. Here's another picture. Herod, he wanted to have the largest harbor in the entire world. Why? He wanted his name to be known. Only problem, in Israel there was no natural harbor, so he did what any of us would do. Based on that problem, he built his own. He was an ingenious guy. Here's what he did. This is a picture of the ruins today. Here's a picture of what it would have looked like in his own day. He wanted it to be 40 acres, so it could fit 300 ships, would be the largest harbor in the world. He actually invented a cement and concrete that would set and harden in water. Very first person to be able to do this, and he built those outer walls so he could create this harbor. Talk about swimming pools, you can see it just at the top of the screen. He had this palace. Jutting out from this palace was this freshwater swimming pool that went out over the Mediterranean Sea. Every luxury was there. Here's another picture. This is also fascinating. Out in the desert, the Judean desert, where it's just foreboding, you can't hardly live there, he decided that he wanted an impenetrable fortress. So at the top of a very high cliff, maybe some of you have even seen this before, a place called Masada, he built an unbelievable fortress palace. Here's a picture of what it would look like. Every amenity. Servants, he actually had people. He needed water up there. He wanted water so that he could live for years up there undisturbed. He had people carry buckets of water one by one up those cliffs so that when he got there would be fresh water. There were pools. There was every kind of granite and porcelain. I mean, this was gardens. This was an unbelievable mountain palace at the top of a high cliff in the middle of a foreboding Judean desert. Just this unbelievable place. This next picture is kind of my favorite when I think about Herod. This is what Herod wanted to do. Halfway between his capital city and Jerusalem, on his way back down to Edom, he wanted to have a palace on top of a mountain. Only problem, no mountain. So you know what he did? He did what you would do. Apparently there was a mountain somewhere else. It's now gone. And he now built a mountain. In fact, if you go to Jerusalem to this day, you stand on the Mount of Olives, you look to the south, it's prominent. You can see it. It's right there. There's this mountain. It hadn't been there, and now it is, which I think gives an interesting context to Jesus' words. You remember at one point he said, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can do what? You can move mountains. There was someone in his day that literally moved a mountain. Now, here, just because we have the swimming pool theme going, this is a picture where you can see the swimming pool. This was a huge swimming pool. Actually, the swimming pool that he had there was the size of 2 Olympic swimming pools with an island out in the center. You can still see all the Roman columns that are there at the bottom. Here's an artist's rendering of what the castle or palace looked like at the top. Had gardens in it. It had servants, porcelain tiles, granite. I mean, every amenity and luxury that you could possibly think of. There were people there who waited on him hand and foot. Here, kind of a final picture so you can see what it probably would have looked like in its own day. This was Herod. And now that I've told you about him, I mean, who wouldn't kind of like a little slice of his life? Right? The money. Like, you know, you see that Powerball, like, I could use $500,000. I don't need $10 billion every year, just, you know, just a little slice. Or the palace. Boy, I'd like to have a home like that with servants to wait on me, to clean up after me, to wait on my every need. I'd like every luxury. Like, look at those pools. I mean, to have your own pool like that. I mean, there's, at least in each one of our hearts, there's a part of us that I think, I mean, all of what we want, Herod had and represented: power, money, authority, fame, renown. He had it all. Okay, as we transition to the third and final character, King Jesus, one last photo. This is probably one of my favorite artist renderings in the entire world. This mountain castle that he had built was about 5-6 miles away from the city of Bethlehem. In fact, it's just straight to the east from Bethlehem. And you know that Jesus was born in a stable, placed in a manger. And here's what you might not know, that on the next day as the sun rose, probably as the sun kind of came up the eastern sky, a shadow would have been cast from his mountain palace right over the place where Jesus was born. Now, I told you there's 2 kings, a big contrast here. We've talked about King Herod. Let's talk about King Jesus. Here's what the book of Philippians says about King Jesus. That though he was in the very nature God, he didn't consider equality with God something to hang on to. Instead, he poured himself out, he made himself nothing, and he took on the very nature of a servant. Just think about this picture, which is up here on the screen. The God of the universe, who was sitting on the throne in the heavens, who had all glory and everyone worshiping and serving him, emptied himself and was born to a poor set of parents who were forced by the Roman government to go to the town of Bethlehem to register for their taxes. They didn't even have a place to stay. They were sent out to the barn. He was laid in a manger. That's just his beginning. Throughout his life, he never had riches or wealth. In fact, at one point he says, listen, I don't even have a place to lay my head. I mean, he was a poor man who gave himself totally to love others, and finally, he poured himself out paying the ultimate price because his mission was to come for one purpose, this cross, where he took all our sin, all our selfishness, he took all our burdens, all the things that keep us from God, our wrong heart, he took that off us, and he took the punishment we deserved. He came to pour himself out. The God of the universe, he gave himself away, withholding nothing. And this passage, I think, provides us with this very stark picture. On the one hand, King Herod, wealthy, seeking glory and fame for himself, creating his own name, being served by others, and Jesus, who came not to be served, but to serve and give his life away. These are the two kings. And as I said before, whenever you have two kings, there's always a question of allegiance. Who is your king? Who do you serve? Who do you admire? Who do you aspire to be like? Now, before you too quickly say, oh, definitely Jesus, just take a moment to survey your heart. Is your heart's natural response to give away? Is your heart's natural response to serve others? Is your heart's natural response to pour yourself out? Or is your heart's natural response, I want more? You see a bigger house, I'd love that. Powerball numbers get flashed. Boy, it'd be nice to have. I mean, okay? And this is what I'm trying to tell you, is that sin turns us inward. Our natural inclination is to want a Herod. What could possibly change that? And I'll tell you, there's nothing we can do. It's only something God can do. He's got to come in, he's got to take out our old heart, and he's got to replace it with a new heart. And I want you to know the good news, that that's what God came to do in the person of Jesus Christ. He paid the price. He laid himself down so that if we'll surrender and believe in him and stake our life in him and trust in him, he will take out that heart of stone. He'll give us a heart of flesh. He'll give us a brand new way to live with a new purpose, a new mission, living with and for him. And that's finally where I want to leave it. There's two kings. King Herod, King Jesus. My question is, who will be your king? To whom will you owe your allegiance? To whom will you bow your knee and serve? And I just pray and trust that it would be today Jesus.